Well, welcome everyone to the DAO Treasury Management panel. To get the ball rolling here, I want to give our panelists a chance to give a quick intro, 30 seconds to a minute about who you are and what kind of protocols you're working on. Let's start here with Kevin.
Hey guys, Kevin Nielsen, founder of Boardroom. We're building a governance aggregator and SDK platform.
Hey y'all, Hart Lambur, co-founder of UMA, which stands for Universal Market Access. I like to think of it as a platform protocol to write contracts between counterparties with arbitrary payouts. What we're best known for is this concept of synthetic tokens. And what we're going to talk about is how synthetic tokens actually become a really useful tool to take DAO's treasury asset, their project token, and convert it into other useful things for financing and incentives and all that kind of cool stuff.
Hey, I'm John Sterlacci, the co-founder of Orca. It's a lightweight DAO primitive to build governance around people based on their expertise, and hopefully to try to streamline governance. Talk about some of the challenges with basically getting people involved in governance, and how we can use that to hopefully fix them.
Nice. Well, thanks for being here. To start, although we have the title says treasury management, we're gonna open up the discussion a little bit more because we have a panel of experts in all sorts of things DAO. So to start with, DAOs are have recently picked up a lot of interest from the crypto community. DAOs have been around for a long time, but apparently if you're like me and you're scrolling through Twitter, you see a DAO popping up every single day. But the reality is that we're still in this very primary and exploratory phase for these new forms of organization. And naturally, this experimentation phase comes with some hurdles and some challenges. So in your opinion, what are some of these hurdles and challenges that you guys see DAOs experiencing right now on their way to becoming more efficient forms of organization?
Yeah, I can kick it off real quick. I mean, I think at the end of the day, DAOs are essentially just tools. They're a set of processes, right? But they don't solve very human behavioral issues. So for the most part, we still deal with very similar issues to any traditional governance structure, where you have to incentivize or you have to convince the people to buy in to the main idea or mandate around this DAO, which is a set of rules and processes that are sometimes enforced on chain, sometimes not. You have to essentially coordinate human behavior around some sort of goal or ideal. And for the most part, I think right now we're seeing is this explosion of experimentation and everything from governance tooling to treasury management tools, contribution frameworks, et cetera, et cetera. But I think right now we're just we don't really know what DAOs even are, right? We're still exploring what the use cases are, what they're relevant for, and what we can set up in terms of process and structure to actually achieve those goals in the first place. So right now I think it was more about a necessity and demand in the market that we needed some sort of framing or some sort of structure to somehow coordinate in this pseudonymous digital fashion. But I think for the most part right now, we're still in the very early stages of figuring stuff out. And I think honestly, the thing that we most have to work on is just tooling and infrastructure. Right now, demand, I don't know if you guys have read the A16Z infrastructure phase article, USV. Oops, don't quote me on that. Where essentially demand and infrastructure, varies in cycles, right? And I think what we've seen over the last year is a massive pull from the demand side, but we still have to develop the infrastructure for a lot of these tools and processes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hart, John,
you go. I'll go next.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is it's a sort of catch-22 problem. People sort of gravitate to an interesting project or something that's going on. There's just so much enthusiasm, so much excitement. And then you have people there and they have to decide, okay, how do we want to coordinate? And it's a coordination issue in and of itself to figure out how do we want to coordinate, because it's not if you do a startup, there's plenty of tooling that you just grab off the shelf. LLC, more specific enterprise tooling. If you don't like it, it's fairly easy to swap it out. But I think the challenge is one, obviously doing stuff sort of in a decentralized on-chain, tied to crypto or blockchain in general. There's sort of a permanence to it, which I guess makes people a little bit more timid to sort of taking a hard stance on one coordination mechanism versus another, and then just getting over that initial hurdle of all right, how are we actually going to coordinate? is probably like one of the most difficult challenges with a community, and ends up usually, grinding the enthusiasm and people down considerably before, the real work can actually get done. And so, hopefully by having, one, better tooling, but, good examples of just like what works, and sort of a life cycle of like, all right, this is what coordination looks like. It makes it a lot easier for people to come together, retain their excitement, and just grab some coordination mechanism right off the shelf.
I guess all I'll add is just DAOs need tools. That's what both you guys are saying. DAOs need tools the same way companies need tools to be useful or work. One of the tools, and I'm biased here, but that I think is really important, is you need the ability to raise money, or incentivize people, write kind of earn-out agreements, that kind of thing. And companies obviously can do that using like legal documents. DAOs can't. And DAO Treasury management here is like, I think it's a big pain point. How can we figure out structures that let DAOs go and raise money in a way that feels aligned with the community and is actually like enforceable, because they can't write a legal contract with, venture capitalist XYZ.
Totally. So DAOs naturally now are becoming more and more involved in like the governance aspect of like protocols and permissionless blockchains. If we believe that a lot of this economic activity is going to be onboarded into these permissionless blockchains and these decentralized protocols, which I imagine most of us do, you wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case. How do we make sure that DAOs don't become just corporations? How do we build on top of what we know and improve on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit dangerous to draw contrasts with corporations usually, because like these structures are completely different. I mean, the use cases you guys are already seeing are like completely varied as well, and they differ greatly from just like the off-the-shelf structures that like a C corp or LLC can provide. I think the biggest danger that we have right now is essentially like in corporate governance, there's zero participation from shareholders, right? Like there might be less than 5% of shareholder participation, and most of it is actually like delegated to proxies by the brokers, right? So like 37 or 40% of all governance power in the corporate world and Fortune 500, I think, is controlled by like ISS and Glass Lewis. So a couple of like proxy advisory firms. I think the biggest danger the DAOs face is literally going into like this very opaque structure where we're pushing governance theater more than anything. But at the end of the day, it's like a very small number of stakeholders that are actually making decisions, which I think is honestly what's happening now for most DAOs. Not to be a downer, but like I think as we experiment with these structures, like we have to figure out better ways of like setting up accountability systems and setting out frameworks where the delegation of responsibility is very, very transparent, and we can actually like make efficient decisions, right, with a small number of managerial stakeholders that are accountable to the broader set of token holders. And I think that's really what's missing from like the corporate governance world. That's where we have an opportunity to like completely diverge, right, and like differentiate ourselves. But I think we're not there yet. I mean, we're just like trying out these structures. And at the end of the day, like a DAO like FWB or Index is going to need a completely different set of rules than like a Compound or a Uniswap, right? So as we develop standards as well, I think we're going to essentially start seeing different tools that fit better for different use cases as well. And there's not going to be like this cookie cutter LLC C Corp style kind of like structure. We're going to have almost these like governance and like operational Lego blocks, to build on, which is super fascinating.
You might see a C Corp like structure emerge in like 5 years, right? And it won't be like a C Corp, it'll be something else, right? But I think the one thing I'd add to Kevin is like you're forgetting that this stuff is programmable. And that's like the ability of like programming a company makes it a different thing. Programming like, hey, if you vote, if you manage this company, if you do work to progress this DAO, you get some reward, you get some opportunity. Like the possibilities are kind of limitless. That's pretty freaking wild. So. Yeah,
and I think a lot of the programmability and like the limitless possibilities kind of, at least at this point, like it's makes for a really bright future, but it kind of engenders some like analysis paralysis of like, we can literally do anything. Like it's a completely blank slate. Like, what do we build? And so I think we're going to see, some, really basic primitives initially and sort of organic growth around them. As these DAOs mature a little bit more, they can start using more sophisticated, more advanced incentive alignment mechanisms, and sort of the sky's the limit at that point.
Yeah, fascinating. I think one area that at least I am personally interested in this area of DAOs is their massive treasuries. Now we've got, over the past 12 to 18 months, a lot of these DAOs have amassed a humongous amount of money. And we are in the situation where they're trying to manage it either through grants or through incentives. So in your opinion, what you see in general in the landscape, what are some of the areas that these DAOs can work on a little bit more to improve the treasury management landscape?
For sure, and I think you have a lot to say on this, but I can give it a bit of context.
That was for Hart, but you took it, man. So
I have a bit of context, just real quick.
Go, Kevin, go.
Just real quick, I think over the last 3 years, if you guys remember Aragon and DAO Stack, et cetera, launching in 2017-18, the focus was always on governance, governance, how do we make decisions? And no one really kind of developed all the other operational tooling that we need adjacent to basic governance and managerial decisions. And I think what's become super apparent over the last 6 months is the insane amount of unused funds sitting in these treasuries that are completely underutilized, partly because there's no tooling, but also partly because there's literally no way to make decisions around how to actually use those funds in the first place. So governance is so ineffective that we can't even decide how to deploy those funds, right? Which I think is why what you guys are building is so cool, right? There's tools that just make it so easy, the UX so easy, that it's just very straightforward to actually make a decision around how to use these funds and how to deploy them effectively.
That is a hilarious way of framing it. It's so 15 months ago, none of these DAOs had any money. The DAO, we forget how recent that is, but DAOs did not matter because they didn't have any project tokens worth anything 15, 18 months ago. And now, to Kevin's point, they have billions of dollars, but they don't know how to they can't even agree on what to do with it, right? Which I think is really fascinating. But okay, so from a treasury management perspective, what do you do if you have a DAO with $1 billion treasury of its own project token? What do you do with that, right? And if you do make analogies to traditional corporate finance or whatever else, you might borrow against it. You might sell it in some sort of restricted way so that it can't put too much pressure on your sale price. You might give it away in incentive structures. Classically, you could only give away those incentive structures via employee options or something like that. But now you can give them away to your community. You can give it to anybody, right? But how do you actually go and write those agreements so that have those payouts happen when they should happen and enforce those payouts? And that's something that if you start looking at this idea of synthetic tokens that Uma's worked on, Synthetics has worked on, it's been in the space. What we can actually do is create a derivative token. So we take the project collateral of the DAO and go and create a derivative token that will pay out under some set of circumstances. That derivative token could be, again, a loan where we're going to pay you an interest rate collateralized by the project treasury that matures in a year's time. Or it could be, we invented this other thing we called a success token, more for VC investors, where you buy a project token plus a call option plus a warrant that aligns investor interest. Or it could be a vesting, an earnout contract. We kind of call these KPI options, where you give it to your community, and if good things happen, if they help good things happen, you get a payout. But generally speaking, what we need to invent, part of the tooling here is how do we write and enforce contracts that can pay out this huge stack of project tokens in a way that is DeFi native and doesn't, we can't even write a legal contract if we want because there's no legal entity for these DAOs. So.
Yeah, and I think the sort of success tokens and you talked about having these metrics that you hit for payout is super interesting because, like you said, there's no legal entity, and so the idea of being able to sue a bad actor or bring something to court or any type of this sort of existing legal safety net that a lot of these corporations have just don't exist in the DAOs, and so the DeFi native way or DAO native, crypto native way of doing that is incentive alignment. And you can't, there's no like threat of violence. The police aren't, well, maybe, for, you being a bad actor in a DAO. So the idea is like, how do we incentivize people to sort of work for a common goal? And so, it's very easy at a protocol level because like the common goal is, pretty basic, but as you sort of grow and evolve into these sort of, nebulous organizational structures, like goals and, the direction they're even headed gets a lot more complicated. And it's like, how do we start creating frameworks and creating North Stars around that, and then sort of encoding them on-chain in contracts to sort of make sure that we're, pushing everybody in the right direction and generally disincentivizing bad actors.
Yeah, and I want to stay in this topic a little bit longer because my colleague Mason and I did some research on the composition of these treasuries. And what you see 80% of the time is that these DAOs hold 95% of the treasuries in their native token. And if you are somewhat familiar with like just the volatility of these things, you realize that one day you can have $1 billion, the following day you can lose 50% of that. So if you're treating this treasury as a war chest to continue the development of your protocol, what are some ways that DAOs can implement some diversification? Maybe like, is there some tooling out there that make it easy for them to do this? Like, how does the community look at dumping native token versus like getting other things? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So you have $1 billion. Let's just keep going with this example. If you have $1 billion treasury, right, of like the Kevin tokens, right, and like you've got this crazy problem where I've got $1 billion of Kevin tokens, but I know I can't sell 100 million of them because the token price will crash. But I do want to weaponize this. So what should you do here? Well, I think you're supposed to use that as collateral and give it away in ways that vest over time. So I'm going to take this Kevin token. I'm going to say, hey, my Kevin token in 2 years' time is going to pay out. You're going to get 100 Kevin tokens. Like Roberto, you're going to get 100 Kevin tokens in 2 years' time if Kevin, I don't know, makes it through the rest of the day, yes. Right? Like, whatever, build something, right? There you go. And now all of a sudden you, Roberto, are like aligned in his success. You want Kevin to do this. And that's like a really clever way of using incentive alignment and kind of mechanism design to weaponize your treasury, to achieve an outcome you want, and use it for a useful purpose without like dumping it on the market. And I think if you, again, go back, this is a lot of like, in some ways, it's like financial engineering, corporate finance stuff, where if you have resources, how can you use them in a way that doesn't harm you, right? So you don't want to dump your token price. How can you use that resource in a way that doesn't harm you, but that gets you something today? And yeah, giving people this derivative token, this synthetic token backed by Kevin tokens, it's not going to be worth as much as just giving them Kevin tokens, but it doesn't dump on the token price today, and it could be worth more. You're still capturing some of the value and driving some of the action towards this like North Star or common goal you're going after. And I think that's it's pretty fascinating, at least.
Yeah, and I think it's a huge imperative to figure out ways that you can sort of diversify and utilize these treasuries now in sort of the peak of the bull market, because come bear market, like that is the project's sort of fat store for winter. And having to diversify it then is going to be way more painful. And I think we're going to see that a lot of the sort of most successful projects or DAOs or organizations in diversifying their treasuries are going to be the ones that sort of are able to move quicker, last longer through the bear market, and come out make up a lot of ground when everyone else is sort of in a much more painful position.
Isn't it funny that we're seeing all these social token projects launch like treasury diversification rounds, which is just like 4 VCs just like buying their token, like giving them a bunch of stable coins. It's like literally people like don't really know what to do with these like huge stacks with 90% of like their own like native token. So yeah, better tooling and just reinforcing what they said.
Yeah, 100%. I think when you sort of build a community on like hodl at all costs, and then you have to say, wait, actually we gotta sell some of this. Like it's definitely convincing the community that it's good to sort of diversify in their best interest obviously is like very, very counter narrative, but it's super important for having longevity of the project.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on that because Hart's talking over here about all these grandiose financial instruments that I am also fascinated by. But sometimes you're talking to devs that don't give a crap about finance. So do you think that in order for these DAOs to start implementing some of these things, is there an element of education that needs to go into it, or like some better tooling that they can implement? So what are your thoughts on that?
Just adding on to that, how on earth do you convince DAOs to like implement, to like use the primitives, like use the synthetics? I mean, like, do you go through governance? Do you write up a proposal? Do you talk to the core team and like try to like lobby them? Like, this is something like we're also dealing with at Boardroom a lot, right? Like, how do you service these DAOs that have completely different like community structures?
So these are all like the really good questions, and this is part of like the messiness of governance in general, right? Like Kevin, your point is very, you too, John, right? Like, you're like, hey, we're like hodl forever, but by the way, we need to sell 10% of our treasury like ASAP, right? It's a little bit tricky. And so one of the ways to actually do this is to flip this whole thing around and to look at it from the angle of VCs for a second, and a very specific focus where VCs now, there is so much money in the space, they actually like need to be able to buy more than they need to invest in more than just early stage companies. They need to invest in DAOs. They need to invest in some of these bigger projects. And what I want to play with and kind of explore with some VCs, Kevin, to your point, is what if you flip this around and you're like, okay, hey, Andreessen, you've got $3.3 billion now. You've got to go and you've got to invest in some of these DAOs. Your current path of doing this is to go up to the DAO, go up to the leadership of this DAO and be like, hey, we want to give you $100 million, but to buy your token at a 30% discount with a 2-year lock, which sometimes works. Other times you get shat on, right, by the community, right? What if instead you're like, hey, we're going to come up with this other structure where we're buying it at the market, but we're going to get some extra payout. This is the success token idea. We're going to get, if your token hits new all-time highs, we've got a call option struck at a price you've never seen before, and we're asking for this added payout because we want to push your project really high. We want to help your project just do well, right? That now seems like the sort of thing that if a VC goes to a DAO and says, here's our proposal, here's why it's incentive aligned, here's why it's good for everybody, they should say yes to. But Kevin, we'll see, right?
Because you're like using them as a proxy almost, right? To like push like these basic tools that they should adopt.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where once you see it in the wild and it's done successfully, that it becomes one of those those tools in your tool chest that you're able to just grab off the shelf, and it becomes less of like a debate with the community. It's just like, all right, we understand like what this entails. We can say yes, like we're for it. No, we're not for it. But it doesn't become this like long drawn out like how do we design this thing from scratch. So I think that's super important.
But that's also like what we're all trying to do in our own way or angle. We're trying to build the design pattern that DAOs use, right? Boardroom, Orca, like we're interested in this specific, like how to write these treasury management contracts. But I feel like once that design pattern, John, to your point, once it's like established, it goes back again. Once people figured out that in like, Web 2.0 startup financing, people are like, hey, what's the path here? Well, we're going to do our safe contract, and then we've got standard docs for like what our Series C looks like and our Series A, and there's a path, right? That roadmap, that playbook was really useful for financing all of these Web 2 companies, right? We in the broader point of around DAO tooling is we're trying to figure out the same playbook, the same tool set for how that works for DAOs. We just have a lot more options, a lot more programmability. It's really freaking exciting. It's also disorienting and potentially like nauseating because there are so many options. It's like analysis paralysis.
But you're right. I think we do see like congregation around specific like frameworks already. We're seeing it around like remember when Governor Bravo launched, right? Like there's projects that see the success in live and actually like replicate it because it works for that specific use case. Snapshot, same thing, right? All these like governance frameworks and stuff are going to see the same things. I think for every DAO tool, DAOs will see it out in the wild because everything's so open and transparent as well. sometimes, and you'll replicate it. Like if it works for your use case. Absolutely, like definitely agree with them.
And I think John brought a good point where someone has to implement it successfully for everyone else to start following. But it's a funny thing because even in traditional markets, if you're a risk manager, like you're there until like some crisis actually hits and you save everyone, and then people are like, okay, we actually need risk managers. So have you guys seen any example of any of these DAOs taking that first step into trying to diversify the treasury to protect everything, or any tooling or any options or any DAOs that have like explored this avenue a little bit more?
Well, Sushi tried to do this, right, and didn't succeed, right? And here's an example that why didn't they succeed? Because everybody wanted to have their opinion on how to do it. And I think it's an interesting example here too of how and it got close in some ways and then didn't happen. And there's a whole story, and I could talk about it, but there's like 360 forum posts, like thoughtful forum posts. And it started again with, I think, a bad idea. They're like, hey, we're going to sell 21 investors 30 million, like 50 million tokens at a 30% discount, and everybody shat on it, right? But then good ideas emerged out of that, but the path dependency actually mattered. I think the end idea actually, this is where the success token idea of a token plus a call option kind of came out of. I actually genuinely believe if that was introduced at the beginning, like a thoughtful investor introduced that at the beginning, the path dependency would have been different, and that could have happened. But this is like, I think the hair on the whole DAO thing. Like, you still got to coordinate all these people, even when the ideas make sense. You still need to coordinate all these people to get it over the line.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting things is like obviously participation across the board is pretty low, but you sort of have this bell curve of like, the mundane day-to-day decisions, like obviously nobody cares about, but then when you try to introduce something that's actually like sort of new and novel, like everybody comes out of the woodwork and, has their opinion about it, and it ends up creating a lot of friction because you have like a lot of noise, a lot of competing opinions. And so I think it's, when we get to the point that some of these things aren't novel anymore, I think there's going to be a lot less friction with implementing them.
Yeah. And I think we are seeing a couple examples like of folks that are trying new things at the very least, even if it's like selling to some VCs, which might not be popular. It tends to be actually where there's a very, very small set of like core contributors that are super involved and very engaged and push the proposal forward, lobby everyone that has to be lobbied, right? And those like initial like 10, 20 people that can just really drive the matter actually like make things happen. I think for DAOs that are a bit like much broader, like Sushi, et cetera, I think what's lacking is like a bit of like essentially the core contributors that can really drive the effort forward in the first place. But I think we'll see that delegation of responsibility evolve. We'll see treasury specific working groups evolve as well. I think we're seeing it with like Index and FWB and Forefront and all these guys. They have literally a group of 10 people that are full-time focused on treasury management. As we see that like that delegation of responsibility evolve, I think we'll literally see a lot more experimentation, a lot more like folks that can actually drive the effort forward.
Totally, man. Super, super excited. And I think we ran out of time. Thank you so much for taking the panel, taking the time, guys.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for coming.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Thank you.